The most unsettling part about betrayal is not the accusation. It is the calm that follows it. The steady handshakes. The reasonable explanations. The way everyone reassures you that everything will be fine, right before they quietly step out of reach. When Daniel Whitaker realized the men who damaged his family had not panicked but prepared, he understood something chilling. This was never chaos. It was choreography. Miles Whitaker had spent years building his construction firm with deliberate care. Clean compliance records. Transparent accounting. No shortcuts. He believed that if you did the right thing consistently, the right thing would protect you. That belief cracked the morning a formal regulatory complaint arrived alleging reporting inconsistencies and procedural violations. It was written with unsettling precision. Not emotional. Not dramatic. Just credible enough to freeze contracts and ignite review. Within 48 hours, 2 pending projects were suspended. Insurance carriers requested clarification. Industry contacts adopted a tone of careful distance. No one accused Miles directly. They used words like concern and temporary review. It sounded manageable. That was what made it dangerous. Russell Dane and Carter Bellamy, Miles' business partners, responded with composure that almost felt generous. They encouraged patience. They emphasized unity. They proposed dissolving the LLC temporarily to shield personal assets until the investigation cleared everything. Their voices remained calm. Their posture relaxed. There was no confrontation, no raised voices. Just strategy presented as protection. Daniel Whitaker watched from the edge of the room. He was not a man who reacted loudly. Years of discipline had trained him to observe before speaking. He noticed how Russell seemed prepared for questions about insurance exposure. He noticed how Carter referenced an internal audit before the regulatory board had formally acknowledged initiating one. It was subtle. Almost invisible. But the rhythm of their reassurances felt rehearsed. That night, Miles carried visible strain, pacing through the quiet house while Elena Whitaker moved gently beside him, steady as ever. She reminded her son that investigations did not equal guilt. That integrity withstands scrutiny. Daniel said little. His silence was not detachment, it was alignment. Something inside him had shifted into focus. When the house fell asleep, Daniel opened his laptop. He searched corporate filings first. Secretary of State records. Business registration updates. Dissolution notices. He was not looking for proof of betrayal yet. He was studying sequence. Timing reveals intention more clearly than emotion ever does. He found the dissolution filing. It had been submitted 3 days before the regulatory complaint. Daniel did not feel rage. He felt confirmation. The complaint had triggered frozen contracts and reputational damage. The dissolution had protected individual assets from liability exposure. But the order of events mattered. Protection had been prepared before accusation. That was not reaction. That was planning. The next morning, Russell and Carter announced their intention to relocate operations out of state, framing it as expansion during uncertainty. Their explanation sounded practical. They reassured Miles that once the investigation concluded, collaboration could resume. Smiles were exchanged. Encouragement offered. Calm prevailed. Daniel noticed something else. Vendor contracts were being reassigned unusually quickly. Equipment listings were updated with new ownership references. Insurance modifications had been processed days earlier. Each action, isolated, seemed ordinary. Together, they formed a quiet exit. Miles wrestled with confusion more than anger. He questioned himself. He replayed meetings in his mind, searching for a misstep. Daniel did not allow guilt to settle prematurely. He reminded his son that trust is not weakness. But he also knew that misplaced trust can become leverage in someone else's strategy. 3 days later, Daniel checked property transfer databases connected to the firm's heavy equipment. Several serial numbers had shifted to a newly registered holding entity under Carter's extended corporate network. The registration timestamp aligned with the dissolution filing. Calm exterior. Strategic withdrawal. Asset insulation. Daniel did not confront them. He did not send a warning email. He began documenting. He printed filing confirmations. He saved metadata. He created a quiet timeline in a leather notebook that never left his desk. Silence, he understood, often invites overconfidence. If Russell and Carter believed the Whitakers were stunned into passivity, they might grow careless. Meanwhile, social media posts began appearing from Russell's newly registered company in another state. Photos of fresh job sites. Announcements of new partnerships. The speed was remarkable for men supposedly navigating uncertainty. Daniel studied those posts carefully, noting equipment in the background. Logos partially covered. Familiar machinery repainted. Each discovery deepened the pattern. This was not panic. This was relocation. Elena sensed the steady transformation in her husband. He was not angry. He was focused. She asked only one question: "What are you going to do?" Daniel answered with measured calm that they would wait. That timing would matter more than emotion. That responsibility, once documented, does not disappear. Miles struggled with the temptation to confront his former partners immediately. Daniel advised patience. An accusation made too early could be dismissed as defensiveness. Evidence presented at the right moment could not. The next evening, Daniel refreshed the Secretary of State portal again. A new filing appeared under Carter's name. Business registration in Tennessee completed the same afternoon the regulatory complaint had been formally acknowledged by the board. Expansion, they had called it. But Daniel saw the truth. They had not dissolved because of the complaint. They had launched the complaint because they were dissolving. And that realization changed everything. Because if the complaint was not retaliation for mismanagement, but cover for an exit, then what they had done to Miles was not protection. It was positioning. Daniel closed the laptop slowly, understanding the stakes had shifted. Russell and Carter believed distance would protect them. They believed calm presentation would obscure calculation. They believed the Whitakers would focus on clearing their name instead of examining the timeline. They were wrong. Daniel Whitaker was not interested in argument. He was interested in sequence. And the sequence was beginning to reveal something far more deliberate than anyone in that polished conference room had expected. If someone plans to disappear, the first thing they erase is noise. No arguments. No dramatic resignations. Just paperwork filed quietly at midnight and equipment that seems to move without explanation. And when Daniel Whitaker began tracing the quiet movements behind Russell and Carter's exit, he realized they hadn't just stepped away from responsibility, they had engineered a vanishing act. The calm surrounding the complaint against Miles still lingered like a fog. Industry contacts spoke carefully. Vendors avoided commitment. Everything felt paused, suspended in uncertainty. Yet beneath that stillness, Daniel sensed motion. The kind of motion that only shows up if you are patient enough to look for it. He began with public records, returning to the Secretary of State databases, not once but repeatedly over several days. Business filings often reveal more in timing than in content. He searched for newly registered entities tied to familiar names. It did not take long before one appeared: Bellamy Infrastructure Holdings. The registration date aligned almost perfectly with the dissolution of their original LLC. The listed registered agent had been updated at 12:07 a.m., a detail most people would overlook. Daniel did not. He printed the filing confirmation and placed it in a growing folder on his desk. No commentary. No accusations. Just sequence. Meanwhile, Miles tried to hold steady. He continued responding to regulatory inquiries with professionalism, providing requested documents, cooperating fully. The emotional weight pressed on him in quieter ways. He questioned whether his trust had been naive. Whether partnership had blinded him to subtle warning signs. Daniel listened carefully but redirected the focus away from guilt. Mistakes require evidence. Regret without clarity serves no one. Instead, Daniel expanded his search. He reviewed asset transfer records tied to the former LLC. Heavy machinery, the backbone of the firm's operational capacity, had been reassigned through a structured sale to the newly formed Bellamy Infrastructure Holdings. Serial numbers matched. The transfer amounts were listed as internal restructuring values rather than market price. The effective date of transfer preceded the public announcement of dissolution. It was not rushed chaos. It was premeditated insulation. Daniel felt the shift again, that steady internal alignment confirming what instinct had suggested. This was not a reaction to the regulatory complaint. It was preparation for it. He studied equipment relocation manifests filed through interstate transport logs. Several machines had crossed state lines under leasing documentation rather than ownership transfer, creating a temporary gray area that obscured responsibility. The relocation dates fell neatly between the dissolution filing and the complaint submission. Miles watched his father work without fully understanding the depth of his method. There were no dramatic declarations, no vows of retribution. Daniel's posture remained calm, almost gentle. He encouraged his son to continue responding with professionalism, to maintain composure publicly. Silence, he explained quietly, often reveals more than confrontation. One evening, while reviewing insurance documentation, Daniel noticed something that tightened the pattern further. The liability policy covering regulatory risk had been cancelled 1 week before the compliance complaint was filed. The cancellation had been processed electronically with acknowledgement from both Russell and Carter. Insurance withdrawn. Assets transferred. New entity registered. Complaint submitted. The sequence no longer resembled coincidence. It resembled choreography. Elena sensed the gravity without needing every detail. She understood that Daniel was not building a case out of anger but out of protection. Her presence in the house remained steady, offering Miles reassurance that truth has a way of surfacing when met with patience rather than panic. The warmth she carried prevented the investigation from turning cold or vengeful. Daniel began mapping the timeline across his office wall, connecting filing confirmations, asset transfers, insurance adjustments, and regulatory dates. Each document anchored the next. He did not share this map publicly. He did not alert Russell or Carter that he was watching. He allowed them to believe distance had softened scrutiny. Social media posts from the new company began appearing more frequently. Photographs of freshly painted equipment at job sites in Tennessee. Announcements of contracts secured quickly after relocation. Daniel examined those images carefully, enlarging them to capture identifying features. Serial plates partially visible beneath new paint. Equipment configurations identical to those listed in prior asset inventories. Miles felt a mix of anger and disbelief. The speed of their expansion now looked less like ambition and more like transfer. Yet Daniel cautioned against emotional interpretation. Evidence must stand independently of feeling. They would not accuse. They would document. Days passed with quiet precision. Daniel requested certified copies of the regulatory complaint submission metadata through formal channels available to involved parties. When the confirmation arrived, it revealed the IP address used to file the complaint. He noted it but did not react immediately. Instead, he cross-referenced it against publicly listed business addresses associated with Russell's consulting activities. The overlap was subtle but undeniable. The emotional shift within Daniel completed itself then, not into anger, but into clarity. Confusion had transformed into deliberate observation. He no longer wondered whether something felt off. He understood that it was. Still, he said nothing to Russell or Carter. Silence remained his ally. Overconfidence, he suspected, remained theirs. One late evening, as he reviewed a bank transfer log tied to escrow accounts previously shared under the old LLC, he found a transaction that had not been disclosed during the dissolution briefing. Funds had moved from a joint operational reserve into an account linked to Russell's newly registered company 2 days before the regulatory complaint was filed. Daniel stared at the timestamp for a long moment. The transfer amount was not catastrophic. It was strategic, just enough to stabilize initial operations in Tennessee without raising immediate alarms. And there it was. The connection between the complaint and the new company was no longer circumstantial. It was financial. Daniel closed the folder gently, aware that this discovery changed the stakes entirely. Russell and Carter had not simply exited a partnership. They had insulated assets, redirected equipment, withdrawn insurance, and positioned themselves behind a complaint that froze Miles' operations at the precise moment their relocation required minimal interference. They believed no one would notice. But Daniel Whitaker was no longer observing out of instinct alone. He was documenting with intention. And the transfer he had just uncovered would become the thread that unraveled everything they thought they had secured. The most powerful move in a conflict is often the one no one sees. When you refuse to react, when you withhold outrage, when you allow the other side to believe their version of events has settled without resistance, something subtle begins to happen. They relax. They grow comfortable. They start moving faster. And that comfort, more than confrontation, is what begins to reveal the truth. By the time Russell Dane and Carter Bellamy fully relocated their operations to Tennessee, the narrative appeared stable on the surface. Miles Whitaker's firm remained under regulatory review. Contracts were stalled. Industry whispers carried uncertainty. Meanwhile, Russell and Carter presented their move as expansion, fresh opportunity born from difficult circumstances. Their online presence reflected optimism. New job sites. New partnerships. Clean equipment bearing fresh branding. Distance, they believed, had created safety. Daniel Whitaker understood something they did not. Silence is not surrender. Silence is space. And space invites motion. He did not file a lawsuit. He did not send a formal demand letter. He did not publicly challenge the regulatory complaint. Instead, he quietly retained a forensic accountant with experience in corporate restructuring cases. The engagement was discreet, framed as a financial review rather than an accusation. Daniel provided documentation without commentary, asset transfer records, dissolution filings, insurance cancellations, escrow movements. He asked for clarity, not confirmation. Meanwhile, Russell and Carter accelerated. Vendor contracts once associated with the Whitaker firm began appearing under Bellamy Infrastructure Holdings. Language within the proposals mirrored prior bid submissions almost word for word. Structural layouts, pricing frameworks, and even phrasing patterns carried unmistakable resemblance. Daniel compared archived bid documents side by side, marking similarities with calm precision. He did not interpret emotionally. He documented structurally. Employee movement followed a similar pattern. 2 mid-level managers previously bound by non-compete agreements quietly appeared on Tennessee payroll records. No public announcement accompanied the transition. The shift was subtle, almost administrative. But timing told its own story. Employment contracts overlapped within weeks of the dissolution filing. Miles struggled privately with the weight of watching without reacting. The instinct to defend, to clarify, to confront felt natural. Daniel reminded him that premature confrontation can strengthen the opposition's narrative. If Russell and Carter expected outrage, giving them silence would disarm that expectation. Patience was not weakness. It was preparation. Elena supported this posture with gentle steadiness. She ensured that the household atmosphere remained grounded, that frustration did not harden into bitterness. She spoke often about grace, not as forgiveness without accountability, but as composure without hatred. The family would not allow betrayal to reshape who they were. As weeks passed, Daniel monitored public updates from Tennessee. Photographs of active job sites revealed machinery with familiar wear patterns despite new paint. Serial configurations aligned with equipment previously logged under the Whitaker firm's inventory. Timestamp analysis showed that some projects had commenced within days of regulatory review, freezing Miles' operations. The overlap was too precise to ignore. Then the forensic accountant delivered preliminary findings. Financial movement from the Joint Operational Reserve had stabilized Bellamy Infrastructure Holdings during its first month of activity. The transfer Daniel had discovered earlier now sat within a broader financial pattern, small but strategically timed reallocations that positioned Russell and Carter comfortably before the complaint disrupted Miles' revenue stream. Still, Daniel did not confront them. Instead, he requested certified metadata associated with the original regulatory complaint submission. The process required formal authorization and patient waiting. When the documentation arrived, it revealed submission timestamps and the originating IP address. Daniel cross-referenced the data with publicly listed business registrations tied to Carter's consulting entity. The match was precise. The complaint that triggered Miles' regulatory freeze had originated from a device registered under Carter's firm. Daniel absorbed the discovery without visible reaction. He did not celebrate. He did not express anger. He simply added another confirmed point to the timeline now stretching across his office wall. Asset transfer. Insurance cancellation. Dissolution filing. Complaint submission. Vendor reassignment. Employee transition. The pattern no longer resembled suspicion. It resembled architecture. Russell and Carter, confident in the quiet, continued expanding operations. They believed legal exposure had dissolved alongside the LLC. They believed Miles would focus solely on clearing his name rather than examining sequence. Their comfort showed in their speed. Speed revealed connection. The escape route they had engineered began narrowing, not because Daniel attacked it, but because he traced it patiently. One evening, as he reviewed the full timeline with the forensic accountant's final summary in hand, Daniel understood the next step required confirmation beyond documentation. Records establish structure. Physical verification establishes certainty. He needed to see the operation in Tennessee firsthand, not to confront, not to accuse, but to align observation with proof. Miles watched his father book a flight without fanfare. There was no dramatic announcement, no vow of reckoning. Only quiet intention. Elena met Daniel's steady gaze and understood that this journey was not about revenge. It was about responsibility, about ensuring that what had been done to their family did not remain hidden behind geography. Russell and Carter believed silence meant safety. They believed distance created immunity. They believed the Whitakers were too wounded to follow. They did not understand Daniel Whitaker's discipline. He was not traveling to argue. He was traveling to confirm. And when confirmation arrives, comfort has nowhere left to hide. The most unsettling part of being followed is not the confrontation you expect. It is the realization that someone has been watching long before you noticed. When Daniel Whitaker boarded a quiet early morning flight to Tennessee, he did not carry anger with him. He carried patience. He was not traveling to accuse. He was traveling to verify. Russell Dane and Carter Bellamy had settled into their new operation with visible confidence. Their online presence suggested growth and optimism. Freshly branded trucks. Clean signage. Public announcements about compliance excellence. The irony did not escape Daniel, but he did not allow irony to distract him. Emotion clouds perception. Verification sharpens it. He rented a modest vehicle upon landing and drove to one of the newly announced job sites listed under Bellamy Infrastructure Holdings. The site buzzed with ordinary activity, workers moving with routine focus, machinery humming with steady rhythm. No chaos. No visible wrongdoing. Just business continuing as if nothing had ever happened. Daniel approached as a quiet observer, introducing himself simply as a regional supplier representative exploring potential partnerships. His tone remained courteous, neutral. He asked no pointed questions. He requested no explanations. He merely observed. It did not take long for the details to surface. The heavy excavator positioned near the center of the site bore a fresh coat of paint, but beneath the new branding, subtle surface patterns revealed familiarity. Daniel stepped closer under the pretense of reviewing equipment capacity. The serial number plate, partially obscured by a new mounting bracket, matched documentation from the Whitaker firm's prior inventory logs. He did not react outwardly. He noted it mentally, then discreetly photographed the identification plate with his phone. Another piece of machinery displayed a recently applied decal layered over faint adhesive residue from an older logo. Daniel leaned casually to inspect the VIN number etched into the frame. It aligned with transfer records that had never been fully disclosed during the dissolution briefing. The effective transfer date, according to official documentation, postdated the equipment's presence at this Tennessee site. He continued walking slowly, absorbing detail rather than chasing it. Site permits were posted near the entrance trailer. He photographed them as well, capturing contractor registration numbers and project approval dates. Each timestamp added another thread to the timeline he had been constructing at home. Inside the temporary office trailer, framed compliance certificates hung neatly on the wall. Daniel noticed one bearing Russell's name listed as compliance advisor for the new entity. The detail carried quiet weight. Russell had accused Miles of procedural irregularities, yet here he stood presented as an authority on regulatory adherence. The contrast was not dramatic. It was revealing. Daniel maintained emotional neutrality. He did not confront Russell, even when he spotted him across the site reviewing blueprints with a local foreman. There was a brief moment when their eyes nearly met from a distance. Daniel turned away calmly, avoiding recognition. This was not the moment for exposure. Timing remained essential. Before leaving, he circled the perimeter once more, ensuring he had captured sufficient visual documentation, serial plates, VIN numbers, permit postings, equipment configurations. He made mental notes about equipment where patterns consistent with prior usage under Whitaker operations. These were not generic machines recently purchased at auction. They were assets with history. As the sun dipped lower in the Tennessee sky, Daniel returned to his rental car with a steady breath. He did not feel triumph. He felt clarity. Physical verification carries a different weight than digital records. It removes ambiguity. It transforms suspicion into structure. That evening, alone in his hotel room, he cross-checked the photographed serial numbers against archived purchase invoices from the Whitaker firm. The alignment was exact. According to official transfer filings, certain assets had been reassigned weeks after their documented appearance at the Tennessee job site. In simple terms, the paperwork lagged behind the physical movement. They had moved equipment first. They had formalized transfer later. They had assumed no one would follow. Daniel reflected briefly on the emotional undercurrent of the journey. There was no hatred in him. No desire to humiliate. What he felt instead was protective resolve. His son's name had been placed under scrutiny while the very individuals responsible repositioned themselves as compliant professionals in another state. Relocation had not erased responsibility. It had merely concealed it behind geography. The following morning, Daniel visited the Tennessee Secretary of State office in person to request certified copies of Bellamy Infrastructure Holdings registration filings. He reviewed registered agent information, effective dates, and corporate officer listings. Each document reinforced the sequence he had already mapped. Preparation preceded accusation. Relocation preceded exposure. When he boarded his return flight home, Daniel carried no dramatic announcement. He did not call Miles Midair with celebratory confirmation. He sat quietly, reviewing photographs and certified copies with calm precision. The evidence was no longer circumstantial. It was physical, time-stamped, verifiable. Russell and Carter believed relocation erased responsibility. They believed distance blurred accountability. They believed silence meant surrender. What they did not understand was that Daniel Whitaker had never been chasing them. He had been following the truth. And now, with serial numbers, permits, and certified filings aligned, he possessed something far stronger than suspicion. He had proof the assets were never legally transferred when they claimed they were. And proof, once structured correctly, changes everything. Some people believe that if they move fast enough, restructure cleanly enough, and relocate far enough, the past will stay behind them. They mistake distance for closure. They mistake silence for surrender. But responsibility does not expire when you cross state lines, and Daniel Whitaker understood that truth only needs patience to surface. When he returned home from Tennessee, he did not dramatize what he had seen. He placed his phone on his desk, transferred the photographs to his computer, and began organizing them with the same calm precision that had guided him from the beginning. Serial numbers were matched against archived purchase invoices. Equipment identification plates were cross-referenced with asset transfer filings. Site permits were aligned with corporate registration timestamps. Each document strengthened the pattern that had been quietly forming for weeks. Miles watched his father work with a mixture of relief and disbelief. The evidence was no longer abstract. It was tangible, photographed, time-stamped, certified. Yet Daniel's demeanor remained steady. There was no surge of triumph, no emotional release. He reminded Miles gently that evidence must be structured carefully if it is to withstand scrutiny. Emotion cannot carry a case. Documentation can. Daniel scheduled a consultation with a multi-state corporate attorney experienced in asset misappropriation and regulatory retaliation. The meeting unfolded without theatrics. He presented the timeline, the forensic accountant's findings, the insurance cancellation records, the metadata linking the regulatory complaint to Carter's consulting device, and the photographs from Tennessee. The attorney listened carefully, occasionally nodding as the sequence clarified itself. What had once seemed like isolated coincidences now revealed coordinated movement. An evidence binder began to take shape. Section 1 detailed the asset chain of custody, highlighting discrepancies between physical relocation dates and official transfer filings. Section 2 documented the insurance liability cancellation processed 1 week before the regulatory complaint. Section 3 outlined the complaint submission metadata and its originating device registration. Section 4 contained photographic verification from the Tennessee job site. Section 5 included the forensic accountant's analysis confirming that operational funds had been siphoned prior to dissolution. The structure was quiet but formidable. The forensic accountant's final report provided one more critical layer. Financial records demonstrated that specific transfers from joint operational reserves had stabilized Bellamy Infrastructure Holdings during its launch phase. The timing aligned precisely with the regulatory complaint's impact on Miles' revenue stream. It was not a reckless theft. It was strategic repositioning. Daniel reviewed every page before any action was taken. He removed emotional language. He replaced assumptions with timestamps. He ensured each claim rested on documentation rather than interpretation. Elena sat with him some evenings as he refined the binder, her presence softening the intensity without weakening the resolve. She spoke about grace, not the absence of consequence, but the absence of hatred. Justice pursued without cruelty preserves the soul. When the filings were ready, Daniel did not stagger them. He did not leak information to industry contacts. He did not issue warnings. Everything was submitted simultaneously. A civil fraud claim addressing asset misappropriation. An interstate notice documenting improper transfer of equipment across state lines. A regulatory retaliation complaint supported by metadata analysis. The timing was deliberate. Filing them together prevented piecemeal defense. It removed the possibility of quiet dissolution as an escape strategy. It shifted the narrative from allegation to documented pattern. No press release followed. No public statement was made. Daniel instructed Miles to maintain professionalism in all ongoing regulatory communications. The objective was not spectacle. It was correction. Several days later, official notices were delivered to the Tennessee office of Bellamy Infrastructure Holdings. Russell and Carter received formal documentation outlining the claims, supported by certified exhibits. Investors associated with their new venture were notified through procedural channels. Bonding companies requested clarification. Regulatory boards acknowledged receipt of the retaliation complaint. The silence that Russell and Carter had relied upon now returned to them, but it no longer felt safe. Miles sensed the shift even before any response arrived. There was a steadiness in his father's posture that conveyed completion rather than confrontation. Daniel had not chased them emotionally. He had followed them structurally. The burden of explanation now rested elsewhere. Elena reminded her family that whatever unfolded next, they would meet it without bitterness. Accountability does not require cruelty. Restoration does not require humiliation. The goal was never revenge. It was protection of reputation, of integrity, of future stability. Within days, the consequences began rippling outward. Project financing in Tennessee entered review status pending legal clarification. Compliance boards reopened evaluation of the original complaint's origin. Silence settled over Russell and Carter's public communications. They had believed dissolution would end exposure. They had believed relocation would dilute responsibility. But documentation, layered carefully and filed precisely, does not dissolve easily. And this time, there would be no quiet restructuring to slip through. This time, they could not dissolve their way out. There is a moment in every carefully constructed escape when the architect realizes the doors are no longer opening. Not because someone shouted. Not because someone threatened. But because systems, quiet, structured systems, begin responding all at once. Accountability does not storm the room. It settles in, line by line, until there is nowhere left to stand. The first shift came through financing. Bellamy Infrastructure Holdings had secured regional backing for its Tennessee expansion, presenting itself as a clean break from prior affiliations. But once Daniel's filings were processed across jurisdictions, lenders initiated internal reviews. Pending litigation disclosures triggered automatic risk assessments. Project financing on 2 major developments was frozen, not as accusation but as procedure. Financial institutions do not argue morality, they respond to exposure. Within days, the bonding company underwriting Russell and Carter's performance guarantees withdrew provisional support pending clarification of asset ownership disputes. The language used was formal and restrained. There were no dramatic accusations, only references to material concerns and unresolved documentation discrepancies. Calm words. Serious impact. Daniel did not call Russell. He did not email Carter. He did not forward updates or request acknowledgement. Silence remained intact on his side, as intentional as ever. The regulatory board in Miles' home state acknowledged receipt of the retaliation complaint supported by metadata documentation. A counter-investigation was opened, not loudly, not publicly, but officially. The same system that had once scrutinized Miles now shifted its attention toward the origin of the complaint itself. Documentation has a way of redirecting focus without emotion. Miles followed the updates with cautious disbelief. Weeks earlier, he had felt isolated beneath suspicion. Now the structure that had once constrained him began tightening around those who engineered it. Yet Daniel reminded him gently that this was not reversal for satisfaction. It was correction for integrity. Investors associated with Bellamy Infrastructure Holdings began asking procedural questions. Due diligence committees requested clarification regarding asset transfer timing. Equipment listed as collateral required verification of lawful ownership. When discrepancies surfaced between documented transfer dates and physical relocation evidence, internal review processes intensified. Again, no shouting. Just process. An equipment seizure notice was filed under contested ownership statutes, not executed dramatically but formally recorded. The notice did not accuse Russell and Carter of theft in emotional terms. It requested legal clarification of possession versus title at specific timestamps. The language was measured, technical. But its implications were unmistakable. Russell attempted damage control internally. He issued calm reassurances to stakeholders, describing the situation as misunderstanding born from administrative overlap. Carter drafted clarifications about documentation sequencing. Their communications remained composed. They had always relied on calm presentation. But calm could not undo timestamps. Daniel observed developments without commentary. Elena noticed the absence of tension in his posture. The urgency that once filled their home had softened into steady patience. She reminded Miles that justice unfolding through systems often feels slow but carries permanence. There was no celebration at their kitchen table. Only quiet gratitude that truth was moving under its own weight. As financing reviews deepened, one Tennessee project paused entirely pending outcome of ownership verification. Subcontractors sought confirmation before committing additional resources. Compliance auditors requested updated disclosures from Bellamy Infrastructure Holdings regarding prior affiliations and asset origins. The escape, once smooth and confident, began encountering friction at every procedural checkpoint. Still, Daniel did not speak publicly. He allowed structure to speak. Legal service confirmations documented receipt of civil fraud claims. Interstate asset misappropriation notices were acknowledged across jurisdictions. Regulatory bodies exchanged formal correspondence. The system was not attacking. It was aligning. Miles felt a complex blend of relief and humility. The vindication he once longed for now arrived not with applause but with quiet validation. Elena reminded him that bitterness would only dilute the restoration. Forgiveness, she explained softly, does not erase consequence. It releases the weight of hatred while allowing accountability to proceed. Weeks after the initial filings, the most significant development arrived with understated gravity. The State Compliance Board issued a formal request for sworn statements regarding the origin of the regulatory complaint that had triggered Miles' review. The language was precise. The request was mandatory. Under oath. The shift was subtle yet decisive. What had once been narrative became testimony. What had once been positioning became accountability. Daniel read the notice carefully and placed it on the table without comment. There was no triumph in his expression. Only recognition that truth, when structured patiently, moves inevitably toward exposure. Russell and Carter had believed relocation would dissolve responsibility. They had believed restructuring would shield intent. They had believed silence meant safety. Now, silence surrounded them in a different way. Because when accountability arrives quietly, it does not retreat easily. And under oath, calm explanations must answer to sequence. The loudest victories are often the weakest ones. Real justice does not arrive with headlines or raised voices. It arrives in documents signed quietly, in corrections issued without spectacle, in consequences that unfold without applause. And when the moment finally came for Russell Dane and Carter Bellamy to face what they had engineered, there were no dramatic confrontations, only accountability settling in with calm finality. The request for sworn statements changed everything. Under oath, narratives must align with timestamps. Memory must answer to documentation. As legal counsel reviewed the evidence Daniel had assembled, asset chains of custody, metadata linking the complaint submission, insurance cancellation records, financial transfers, the margin for reinterpretation narrowed. Settlement negotiations began not with hostility, but with acknowledgement. Attorneys for Russell and Carter initiated structured dialogue, recognizing the weight of the documentation. The tone was professional, restrained. No one admitted wrongdoing publicly at first. But private language began shifting from denial to resolution. Daniel approached the process with the same steady discipline that had defined every step. He made no emotional demands. He did not seek humiliation. He did not request public apology campaigns or reputational destruction. His objective remained precise: correction, restitution, restoration. Within weeks, terms were outlined. There was formal acknowledgement that the regulatory complaint filed against Miles' firm had originated internally and was submitted without legitimate compliance basis. The language in the agreement avoided inflammatory phrasing, yet the implication was unmistakable. The complaint had been retaliatory. Financial restitution was agreed upon, covering operational losses directly tied to the regulatory freeze. Legal fees incurred by the Whitakers were included in full reimbursement provisions. Asset ownership discrepancies were corrected formally, with amended filings clarifying proper title transfer sequences. The settlement required a written correction submitted to the regulatory board, clearing Miles of the compliance allegations that had shadowed his name for months. The Tennessee Licensing Board initiated its own administrative review. Russell and Carter's operational license entered suspension pending compliance reevaluation. The action was procedural, not punitive in tone. But the effect was decisive. Projects paused. Investors recalibrated. Expansion slowed. Daniel declined every opportunity to escalate the matter publicly. No press release was issued from the Whitaker firm. No industry statements circulated highlighting vindication. When colleagues reached out quietly to express relief at Miles' clearance, Daniel responded with humility rather than triumph. He reminded his son that reputation restored through integrity must remain anchored in integrity. Elena's presence during this phase carried particular weight. She observed the subtle emotional release in Miles, the easing of tension he had carried silently since the first complaint arrived. Yet she also guided him away from resentment. Forgiveness, she explained gently, does not erase what happened. It prevents the injury from reshaping who you become afterward. Miles' company was formally reinstated for bidding eligibility. Insurance carriers restored full coverage. Pending contracts reopened for consideration. Industry contacts resumed communication with renewed confidence. The correction did not come with celebration. It came with quiet recalibration. Russell and Carter fulfilled the settlement terms without public resistance. There were no dramatic apologies, no theatrical acknowledgments. Their communications remained composed, their tone measured. The systems had spoken. Documentation had concluded the argument. One evening, after final settlement signatures were confirmed, Miles sat with Daniel on the back porch of their home. The air felt lighter, though no words marked the transition. Daniel did not recount the strategy. He did not outline the precision of his timing. He simply reminded his son that integrity, once defended patiently, becomes stronger than it was before. There was no victory speech. There was no gloating. Daniel refused to allow consequence to become spectacle. Because for him, this had never been about winning. It had been about protection. The financial restitution mattered, but not as a trophy. It restored operational stability. The written correction mattered, but not as revenge. It restored a name. The license suspension in Tennessee mattered, but not as punishment. It affirmed accountability within systems meant to preserve fairness. Justice, when done correctly, leaves no debris of bitterness behind. As the Whitaker firm resumed its work with renewed steadiness, something deeper settled within the family. They had endured scrutiny without collapsing into anger. They had pursued accountability without surrendering dignity. They had witnessed how patience can outlast manipulation. And yet, beneath the surface of resolution, one truth remained clear to Daniel. He had not followed Russell and Carter across state lines for money. He had not invested months of disciplined silence for restitution alone. There was something far larger at stake than contracts or equipment. Because what he had been protecting was not just a business. It was a legacy. Some people think the story ends when the settlement is signed. They believe the victory is the point. But the real story begins after the noise fades, when no one is watching anymore, and you decide who you will be moving forward. That is where legacy is either protected or quietly lost. And for Daniel Whitaker, this final chapter was never about what Russell and Carter lost. It was about what his family refused to lose. Miles did not rebuild overnight. Contracts returned gradually, one conversation at a time. Industry partners who had once hesitated began reaching out again, their tone steadier, their confidence restored. There were no grand reopening announcements. No public declarations of vindication. Instead, there was consistency. Transparent reporting. Careful compliance documentation. A renewed calm that felt deeper than before. Reputation, once tested and restored, carries a different kind of strength. Daniel understood that survival was not enough. Prevention mattered more than reaction. He quietly implemented structural safeguards within the Whitaker firm that would outlast him. Independent compliance oversight was introduced, ensuring that no single partner could ever manipulate reporting channels again. Quarterly external audits became policy, not because regulators demanded them, but because transparency deserved reinforcement. An asset tracking and verification system was installed, documenting equipment movement with timestamped digital records accessible to multiple stakeholders. It was not dramatic reform. It was disciplined protection. Miles embraced these changes without resistance. The months of scrutiny had matured him. He no longer viewed compliance as a routine obligation but as a shield for future generations. Elena watched her son grow steadier, not hardened by betrayal but strengthened by clarity. She reminded both men that what had happened could either make them suspicious of everyone or wise about systems. They chose wisdom. Under continued regulatory review in Tennessee, Russell and Carter's ventures gradually unraveled. Licensing suspensions extended. Investors withdrew quietly. Projects dissolved without fanfare. Their companies eventually closed not in scandal but in procedural conclusion. No headlines marked the ending. No dramatic collapse unfolded. It was simply the result of sustained scrutiny meeting fragile foundations. Daniel never spoke of it publicly. He did not track their decline with satisfaction. He did not revisit the past for validation. The objective had never been their downfall. It had been the restoration of integrity and the prevention of repetition. When the system corrected itself, Daniel stepped back. One evening, months after the final filings had settled, the Whitaker family gathered for dinner at home. There were no legal documents on the table. No timelines taped to office walls. Only warmth. The steady rhythm of ordinary life returning without tension. Miles spoke about an upcoming project secured through competitive bidding, chosen not because of sympathy but because of trust. Elena smiled with quiet pride. Daniel listened. He understood that legacy is not preserved in courtrooms. It is preserved in kitchens, in policies, in the way children watch their parents respond to injustice. His choice to follow truth rather than chase revenge had reshaped not only a business but a mindset. The Whitaker name now stood not just for competence, but for resilience anchored in patience. They had believed distance would erase responsibility. They had believed time would soften consequences. They had believed the Whitakers would choose silence in the name of peace. They misjudged the one thing that mattered. Daniel Whitaker did not chase them for revenge. He followed them for truth. And truth, when pursued without hatred, becomes protection. In the years that followed, industry peers learned something subtle about the Whitaker firm. Their processes were thorough. Their documentation precise. Their oversight uncompromising. Not because they distrusted the world, but because they respected it enough to prevent harm before it began. Legacy, Daniel understood, is not what people say about you when you win. It is what remains intact when you are tested. From that day forward, anyone who considered cutting corners with the Whitaker name understood something clearly: he was always watching. And now, here's the question that lingers long after the story ends. If you were in Daniel's place, would you have chosen revenge, or would you have chosen patience and proof? If this story moved you, if it reminded you that quiet strength often outlasts loud reactions, share your thoughts below. Like this video if you believe integrity still matters. Subscribe if you value stories where truth wins without shouting.